Order. Welcome everybody to the latest meeting of the Environmental Audit Committee. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dame Glenys Stacey and Ms. Natalie from the Office of Environmental Protection for our regular annual update from the OEP. You're both very welcome. Can I ask you firstly to introduce yourself and to lay out the role, remit and responsibilities of the OEP and where your role fits in within that. So if I could start with you, Dame Glenys.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for the invite today. We're really pleased to be here. So I'm Dame Glenys Stacey. I'm Chairman of the Office of Environmental Protection. That's one of the governance safeguards that government put in post-Brexit to safeguard the environment. Our job is really to hold government and other public authorities to account for their compliance with environmental law, and in the case of government to do our very best to make sure that they meet their ambitions and meet the statutory targets that have been set under the Environment Act. We have a number of powers which you might want to hear about, but I'll hand over to Natalie now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
My name is Natalie Prosser. I'm the Chief Executive of the Office for Environmental Protection, and a very brief summary of our role. We have four main responsibilities. So firstly, we report annually on government's progress against its environmental improvement plan and statutory targets. We have a duty to monitor and report on the implementation of environmental law. We've done a number of studies under that. We receive complaints from members of the public, and we can conduct investigations into compliance with environmental law by any public authority, and indeed we can commence those investigations under our own jurisdiction where appropriate, and we can provide advice to government, and we can do that on our own initiative in relation to new environmental law or on other broader matters related to the environment when requested to do so by ministers. And our jurisdiction is to England and in Northern Ireland as well.
Great. Now, both of you have had a very sort of varied and obviously impressive careers. Dame Glenys, you were Chief Inspector of Probation, Chief Executive at Animal Health, Chief Regulator at Ofqual, Ms. Prosser at the Gambling Commission, then Operations Director at Ofqual, amongst many things. But so it's noticeable that the government selected people with sort of storied careers in regulation as opposed to kind of environmental protection life, as if you put it that way. What does that say, do you think, about the expectations of the role of the OEP, and how important is that regulatory background to the job you're doing now in a very different sort of field? Start with you, Dame Glenys.
Thank you very much. So just to be clear, yes, I have got a strong regulatory background. I like regulation, so do you. It makes us jointly happy if it works well. So we are sort of regulatory obsessives, if you like. But I did spend 5 years as the Chief Exec of Animal Health. Before it was Animal Health and Plant Agency. So I have been down a few farm tracks as well. I've had experience of regulation in an agricultural environment, let's put it that way. But it's a plain fact that our job is pretty legalistic, actually. You know, we are holding a government to account for compliance with environmental law. And we can take investigations and we can take proceedings against government or other public authorities should we think it appropriate to do so. There is a fair amount of legalistic regulatory work to be done rather than simply holding an opinion, if you like, on the environment and progress. So certainly in my own case, I hope that it's a combination of those experiences of oversight, overseeing the delivery of matters on behalf of government, but also that work at Animal Health which brought me to the table. As far as Natalie is concerned, she is by far the best candidate to be our Chief Executive and is excellent in the role, but I'll leave her to explain her own credentials.
Yeah. Well, I'm not asking you to reapply for your job, so I'm perfectly happy, but I just thought it was interesting that to sort of observe that background. As we know in this place, lawyers are capable of doing other jobs. But Ms. Prosser.
So I, like Glenys, thoroughly love regulation when it's done well. And my background in particular is across a whole range of different regulatory disciplines. But right back at the beginning, I was trained as a litigator and then had a 15-year career as a public lawyer. focused particularly on how public authorities discharge their responsibilities and do that properly, and that included in previous roles establishing investigation and enforcement capabilities and then delivering on those. So when I came over to the OEP, that legal background, and particularly the public law legal background, and my operations background in establishing investigation and litigation functions were what brought me to it. And it was love for the sector that's kept me here, and the opportunity in using that skill set, and of course the broader skill set we've got at the OEP, and we've recruited very successfully a very broad range of experts into the organisation to make that real difference, which is very personally important to me.
Yeah. Now, each of the OEP's progress reports has highlighted that at this stage the government is off target to meet its legal obligations across the board. In the one area where there was good progress in the 2022-23 report, air quality, your latest report suggests that progress has stalled. To what extent do you feel that your reports have led to the government taking the requisite actions required so far?
So that's an interesting question, and of course we've seen a change of government, haven't we, over the periods that we have been reporting. And I know that members of the committee would have looked particularly at government's response to our reports to see the extent to which they are taking our recommendations into account. So if we look at our last report, for example, we made a number of key recommendations. We can see in the response that government has provided to us, in the way it is now acting, that many of those are actually becoming on stream, particularly, I think, the review of the Environmental Improvement Plan. So much is resting, isn't it, on us getting that right. A lot of our recommendations come back in whatever area we're looking at to a failure of delivery planning and a failure of delivery. And we certainly have welcomed this time, I'm talking here about the report that we're being asked on now, we welcome particularly, the move of this government to actually review that plan and make sure that we get delivery plans. And we are hearing those noises from government at the moment. We actually want to see that, don't we? We want to actually see those delivered. I think we'd say broadly that it's a mixed picture in terms of our recommendations being taken into account by government over the times that we've been reporting. We can see that they have influenced in some areas, but not in every area. Might well be what we should expect as an oversight body. We're not always going to be taken account of all of the time, but the direction of travel, I think we have nudge things forward, definitely.
Yeah, and the OEP report has described the current level of non-compliance with environmental law as astonishing, highlighting complex regulations and weak enforcement as key factors. Can you give us examples of areas of particular concern around non-compliance? And is there any sense that government is strengthening both enforcement and understanding of the law?
I think understanding of the law is particularly difficult, and I'll hand over to Natalie in a moment about enforcement generally, but it is a complex body of law, many thousands of instruments, many of them we've inherited from Europe, as you know, and then transposed into our legislation. So public law is always quite difficult, but environmental law, I think, is at the difficult end of that sort of difficult spectrum in terms of understanding and broader public understanding, and indeed understanding for those who do need to comply with it. So we know we've got a challenge there, and we know that the environment itself doesn't have a voice, so that when it is not complied with, it's not necessary that people are jumping up and down recognising that. So we know that there are those difficulties.
Yeah, Ms. Prosser, can you identify particular areas that you're concerned of in terms of non-enforcement?
So it was a holistic assessment I made in terms of my surprise, and if I look at it from two different angles. So firstly, there are numerous sectors subject to environmental law, and if I take a few examples, the water sector, the waste sector and the agricultural sector, all of the regulators responsible for those areas have identified that there are broad ranges of non-compliance, and in some cases serious non-compliance with the criminal law. And the criminal law is an unwieldy beast. It's an unwieldy beast particularly for regulators to use, and it's plenty of evidence on the record in those three sectors and beyond where there has been persistent non-compliance with laws, and that has led to harms arising. So that's one perspective. But secondly, and I've reflected a little bit about environmental law as a discipline, it's an unusual body of law in that it creates obligations on the state, it creates obligations of outcome on the state in terms of targets, and that is quite unusual. And what the law often doesn't do is specify to the state how it should then achieve those targets, and often those targets are longitudinal in time. And we've had cause to look very recently at some very proximate targets. So the marine target, for example, in 2020, which is subject to a live investigation, and the good ecological status for under the Water Framework Directive, which falls due in 2027, and where it has been commented on quite broadly that target is vanishingly unlikely to be met. And we're very cognizant of this, of course, because the OEP was set up to monitor and report annually on progress against the new 2021 Environment Act targets. And in that context, we're particularly interested as to why government has failed historically to meet targets, and our role in securing that those Environment Act targets which have been committed to will be achieved. And it is a very complex picture with some challenging laws where there is very broad discretion on government on how it goes about achieving them. So I was making a kind of holistic assessment, really, but I am surprised, and I reflect on Dame Glenys's comment, that perhaps it's because the environment itself often doesn't have its own voice, and it can be very difficult, even for members of the public, and our experience shows us this, to secure accountability, both from those operators who may be breaking the law, and for regulators tasked with overseeing the law when they are often very stretched and dealing themselves with complex overlapping laws.
And government obviously have responsibility in the end for enforcement, but are government themselves also breaking the law, are you finding?
I'll start again. So if we look at our work so far on the farming rules for water and the report we produced in relation to that, we did question whether government was complying with the law there, because there's a requirement for there to be plans in relation to individual bodies of water that are sufficiently specific. And yet we didn't find, routinely we found that was not the case. And so we did begin to question the level of actual commitment in terms of any real concerted effort to comply with the law. So that was a good example, if you like, at looking at quite a high level at whether people were really, genuinely making every effort to be compliant at the highest level. But at the other end of the spectrum, if you look at the recent and very welcome efforts of the Environment Agency to increase their inspection at farm level, and the rate of non-compliance that's being found on farm, that's, at the other end of the spectrum, that's an individual farm business or farmer not complying with the law, usually in relation to some aspect or other of agricultural pollution. So you've got it at various stages across the spectrum where you would expect compliance to be there.
Yeah. And I mean, turning to your reports, obviously it's important that you do these annual reports and that they then lead to reflection, but also to change. And we've got concerns about the process around OEP reports in terms of its timeliness. Your 2022-23 report is based on findings that end in March 2023. You then publish it in January 2024. The government then have a year to respond to that, meaning that the formal government response to that report comes in January 2025, which is almost 2 years after whatever you found. In the meantime, you've been working on another report. I mean, do you think that process is satisfactory?
No. It does look very clumsy, doesn't it? It doesn't look well designed, the way those timescales sit together. So we have to report by a certain time, usually the end of January each year. As we've been developing as an organisation, we're still only small. There's an awful lot of work goes into such a complex report. We have thought carefully about whether we can bring it forward. It's not easy for us to do that, and indeed we are about to start a similar body of work for Northern Ireland now, so we're going to have double the work as well. So we are really pushed to get this report out in the time set for us by the Environment Act. Government then has up to 12 months to respond. Now, it has been historically it's responded very late in the day. So if we look at the response this year, it was within a few days of the deadline actually that it came out. And it's confusing then for the public to see that, and then a few days later we're reporting again. Government also has to do its own annual progress report, which tends to come out in the summer. Our view is it would be much better if when government reports itself on its own view of progress, it also responded to our report from the January, because then you get it together and we could take into account that response as we prepare the next assessment. So we would urge government to actually get a move on, if you like. Now, sorry, but there are always reasons for government to delay. So in this case, they're waiting for an EIP refresh. There's nothing wrong with government doing an interim response to us. We like that, you know.
No.
If there's something we're waiting for later in the year, we can see that, but we'd still like some response to our recommendations at recommendation level, to engage with our specific recommendations, even if it's only on an interim basis in July, as they report on their own view of progress. We think it would be really healthy to do that.
Yeah, I mean, we have the Secretary of State for Environment in front of us in a couple of weeks' time, and I'm sure that we will be asking him about that. And we were also disappointed that when your report was produced this year, there was no statement to Parliament on that. Now, you know, that calls into question the extent to how much this is kind of central to government's response. If they don't think that it's a significant enough moment for them to come in front of Parliament and actually tell us about what the OEP report is, will you share our disappointment in that, and can you give us a sense as to how you feel that interaction in terms of your office and your findings is going with government?
So we saw that you pressed for that statement, actually, and appreciate your interest in that. Thank you very much. But no, we didn't get a statement before Parliament, which is unfortunate. We do see real engagement, though, with our report. So, for example, shortly after it was produced, I met with Minister Cray, actually, to go through our recommendations, and she has a keen interest in them. She's our day-to-day liaison, if you like, at ministerial level. It's not that our report is being ignored, and we know that the key messages that we got in there are heard by the Secretary of State. In meetings that I've had with the Secretary of State, he's been very clear about that, for example, about the real gap in delivery planning. We know that some of these things are definitely striking home, and we could see in the response that we got eventually in January this year to the report from the year before that they were engaging, for example, in our requests for specific progress in relation to monitoring. So there are good signs, but I agree with you. There's a reluctance, seemingly, to make that public. You know, a public statement to Parliament, a public statement in July in detailed response to our January report would be the way to go in our view.
Yeah, thank you. Chris Hinchley.
Carry further on the point of timeliness, in November 2022, Client Earth, WWF and others requested that the OEP review and report on the systemic failings of the regulatory framework to address nitrogen pollution in England's rivers. It took until January 2024 for the OEP to eventually make a determination on that issue. Are you satisfied with the time frame in which the OEP acted in that case? And could you also tell us what progress the government has since made on revising their guidelines on nitrogen pollution in line with your decision of January 2024?
I'll hand over to you and then come in.
So firstly, no, that timeline is unacceptably long. It was fairly early in the OEP's journey when that came about, and concurrently with that, we were still working with DEFRA about how we would engage with them, particularly on investigations, and that really did slow things down. There's another piece of context on that particular case, and I'll have to be somewhat circumspect because this is still subject to a live investigation in which a final decision hasn't been determined, but there was a key piece of litigation that was going through the courts which addressed very specifically some of the key points of law in that case. And we were very interested to know the outcome of that case because it was very pertinent to the legal questions. There was then a change of government, and essentially what we wanted to do was to give the new government some breathing space to deal with these substantive issues. Now, we felt ultimately that that didn't progress at sufficient pace, and so we moved this particular issue onto a formal investigative footing, and that's where it sits now. which is where I have to stop commenting because that will still be subject to final determination by us. What I would say, though, is that we are having very good and very active and highly engaged discussions with DEFRA on the substance of the issue. So I have some optimism that that case will resolve in a satisfactory manner.
Okay, Barry Gardner.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, Ms. Prosser, can I thank you very much for what you said in December when you exhorted the government, please could you just stop introducing new laws before you've implemented the old ones. I think it's a cry that many of us have felt for a long time, and it was really good that you came out so strongly in saying that. I wanted to focus on your key recommendation 4 from the report, where you talk of setting out clear mechanisms for reconciling competing demands for the use of land and sea. How can the government best go about that? What are the ways that you would like to see that happening and getting that balance right?
Thank you. So just to start, and thank you for your kind remarks about Natalie's legal comments. I'm sure she'll say it more than once.
I'm sure she will.
But just on the point you raise, it seems to us, and we've said it for a while now, that government's got to make some hard strategic choices. It's got to set out some parameters for people to work within, in my view. Now, we've seen some progress of late, so we welcome the consultation we've got on the land use framework. At first sight, it looks like an intelligent approach, and it is underpinned by data and some analysis. Now, I'm sure that people will be looking at the detail, as indeed we are, to see whether all of that stacks up.
Are you going to be making, because it is a consultation at the moment,
Yes,
are you going to be making representations to that consultation?
We will.
Great.
We will, definitely.
And so I don't want to disturb your flow, but
okay.
just whilst we're on that, will you be making any recommendations that relate to looking at catchment management and looking at a catchment basis?
Well, I don't want to tie the team too much at the moment. It's early days, but I'd be surprised if we didn't. There's a common understanding that there's a real benefit to adopting that approach where it suits, isn't there? So,
But it's not in there at the moment, is it?
No, I know. Yeah, it's not. So, government is consulting widely. It's taking quite a good approach to the consultation as well. So, our view is that it looks good on the face of it, but there's so much in the detail here. So when you look at how it's going to sit alongside other strategies and policies that you've expressed an interest in, for example, biodiversity net gain, or local nature recovery strategies, these have all got to line up. They've all got to line up and together form a really strong net to help shape decisions about spatial planning that are taken at a local level. So there's a lot riding on, can't say it enough, there's a lot riding on getting this right in our view. And we will be making representations when we're ready within the 12-month period to give our best view on how that can be done.
And we also take into account the context of the Cunliffe review and the potential exploration there about potential catchment-based approach. Of course, would be very consistent with the Water Framework Directive regulations approach. Then Glenys is quite right. There are a lot of moving parts, and we're very interested in how these parts fit together, and we will do because they are so critical for delivery of the European targets. So, of course, we will be picking up some specifics in terms of responding to the land use framework consultation. But we've got ongoing interests in local nature recovery strategies. We've got some work ongoing on that. BNG's in conduct. We're very interested, of course, in proposals around the Nature Restoration Fund and what that might look like, and planning reform, as well as the Water Commission. So there's an awful lot going on, and it, as ever, all connects one to the other.
So it's really important to us that whatever comes out of this, it is truly aligned to the statutory targets and EIP, that it's almost that those are hardwired into the approach, and I don't quite see that at the moment. I know you've been doing some work looking at biodiversity and net gain, so I won't dwell on that particularly, but on nature recovery strategies. We've been doing some work ourselves on that, so we've engaged, I think, with 38 of the 48 authorities, for example, to see how that's going. We're very keen to get in early on these new initiatives to see that they are working as government and Parliament intends. And you'll know that we've just about to produce a report on EPPS, for example, that was looking at early implementation there. It seems to us really important that these things are aligned and that they set off as they mean to go on.
Yeah. You talk about how we need to correct, I think you say, the underinvestment in site designation and management. Could you just perhaps formulate for us the sort of recommendations that you would like to see this committee make around that?
So we cover it in our report, don't we? I mean, there are a few dimensions to this. First of all, there are some interim targets in relation to SSIs, but we don't see those interim targets particularly well aligned to where government's trying to get to in terms of species abundance. They look very modest, so a certain proportion of them to be inspected for site condition, well, that's fine, but site condition is a static thing unless you do something to improve it. And then the second interim target, as I recollect, is something like 50% of them should be on a road to getting to good condition. And what does that mean? So it seems to us that there's a lack of ambition there in terms of what's being trying to be achieved by these interim targets, and also in relation to site designation itself. Why aren't we having more? Because we do know that the land itself is so key to species. The habitat is so critically important, and that's what these sites are about.
Well, in a sense, that could bring us back to the original point about implementing rather than simply designating. I wanted to ask you about your indicators, because in Table 2.2 in the report, you have there extent of UK area protected for nature at sea. That's on page 39. See, you've got it in front of you. And of course, you've got an upward arrow next to that. Now, anybody who's reading this report who is, not sort of schooled in these matters, just somebody who's reading it out of interest as a member of the public might think, oh, great, yeah, our MPAs have gone up. Areas protected at sea, this seems really good. But in fact, it's not about the protection, it's about the designation.
Yes.
Would it not be better to say the extent of UK area designated as protected for nature at sea? So, because otherwise we're giving a false impression in the indicators that you have here.
I understand your point, and can I take it away and come back to you? I certainly will. But you'll know from the work that you're doing on your own separate inquiry on governance in marine that the real issue here is, again, delivery, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And of course, the failure by the end of last year to progress with the complete stopping of trawling in all of the MPAs.
Yeah, right,
absolutely. And have you made recommendations to government about that?
So we've got an investigation underway at the moment. I don't know whether you know, but we have an investigation because how can I put it with our lawyers not objecting? We want to know whether government has met a particular target in relation to marine. And obviously we have some suspicions about that. But we also want to see...
This is a statutory target, is it not?
Yeah, it is. But what, so... And it's if it's not missed, it's passed some years ago. But we don't want to see these targets just walk past. It's just not what they're for. And what we want to see is plans to meet it. Now, there are some component parts here that I don't want to go into particularly, but our view is that much more needs to be done and done pretty quickly now.
Yeah. So again, if this committee were making recommendations from today, it would be for the government to explain how it's achieving the target that it's supposed to have achieved already.
If I may say so, it needs to explain, but it also needs to accelerate progress. That's That's what we're after in conducting this investigation.
Just picking up on what you were discussing with the chair earlier, and again, would it be helpful for us to make a specific recommendation about the timescale of
Yes.
of response?
It certainly would.
It's just good to get you to sort of jog us into, if we've got it on the record, that you would like us to recommend it.
We would certainly
it's
like
helpful.
you to recommend, firstly, that government responds to us at the same time as it reports itself on its own view of progress. The two things can sit as two sister things. And secondly, it would be very helpful if when government does respond, it does engage with our individual recommendations. Now, our last response from government engaged with our key recommendations, but the goal area recommendations, it responded with them grouped, if you like.
Yes.
And obviously a lot was riding in the refreshed EIP basket, understandably. But hopefully we're getting past that now and we can get to the level of these individual recommendations.
Well, these are two ways in which any authoritative body can sort of wriggle out of things. One is to say, well, it was a long time ago,
Yes.
and that's the point of delaying the response for so long. You just say, oh, well, of course, what we're talking about was 2 years ago, it's all changed now. And the other is to, instead of dealing with each of the recommendations, to lump them all together and make it look as if you've dealt with all of them, when in fact you've only partially dealt with them.
Absolutely, and you may have bought yourself time to deal with them, but they may still not be dealt with. Now, we do know that we have influence and impact in other areas. We can point to a number of things, neonicotinoids, for example. But yes, it seems to us that this annual report, it's a prime product for us. A lot of work goes into it. I think it is increasingly seen as a definitive statement on the state of the environment. We hope it is hugely helpful to you as a committee.
It is.
Thank you. And it would be really helpful to us if we could have a sufficiently timely and detailed response. Now, responses are getting better. You know, the one we had in January this year was much better than the one before. But let's see it get better still and more timely, please.
Look, finally, I just wanted to ask you about how you think that the land use framework could best support flood resilience.
The what framework, sorry?
The land use framework.
Oh,
how
right.
that could best support flood resilience.
How could it best support flood resilience? Well, there are a number of underlying principles in it, aren't there? Really affecting how agricultural land will be used over time in the period to 2050. It is proposing, for example, almost 20% change in use, more towards the environment. And it seems to me quite important that when you're implementing that and overseeing it nationally and implementing it locally, it's really important to get those land use changes right, in the right area. You know, so you've been speaking, I think, about taking a catchment response, for example, approach. It's actually getting the right things done in the right place, isn't it? And that must be about providing more support to those who have to change the use of land, to make sure, we've got a tree target that's not going to be met, but more tree planting would help with flooding if it was in the right places. You know, there are ways in which things can synchronise here. There's a real opportunity here to make sure the land use framework does more than one thing. Yeah?
Yeah. I mean, my fear is that we know that 59% of grade 1 agricultural land is highly susceptible to flooding.
Yeah.
And therefore, if we don't get the overall land strategy right, then actually it's a very serious threat.
Yes.
As we have increasing climate change and increasing precipitation and floods.
And this is where you really need there's an opportunity now, if the land use framework is to go ahead as proposed, and it's subject to consultation and no doubt there'll be tweaks, but there's a real chance to look again at ELMS, isn't there, and just make sure that what you're incentivising, particularly now on the higher order schemes, is actually delivering more than one thing. And flood defence is really important, and potentially, you can achieve it alongside other environmental outcomes if you get that relationship right.
And if I haven't already tried to lead the witness, can I certainly try over this? In relation to ELMS, do you think it's strange that as part of ELMS, we are still encouraging farmers, we're paying farmers to do what 200 years ago, for 200 years, we've known is the sensible thing to do, namely to rotate their crops. Why are we paying farmers to do what any sensible farmer, any competent business would be doing? Why aren't we loading it in that higher end and reviewing that system? Are there recommendations we could be making there?
So I think our recommendations so far, certainly from the OEP, have been to... There's a lot of eggs riding in this one basket.
Yeah.
So getting first of all take up right, particularly with the higher order schemes, is important. Secondly, making sure that there is spatial targeting, and I think that's beginning now, but seeing much more of that would be important. And then thirdly, encouraging the right things to hit those targets. I'm afraid I can't comment on rotation. I mean, as you say, it makes a lot of sense. It's what I do on my allotment, and I imagine what. But it's a matter for government, isn't it, whether it thinks it needs to promote that actively. But in terms of delivering its targets, we're pretty clear what needs to happen, and we've made those recommendations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Samuel Wilson.
Thank you. I want to concentrate on the area of the circular economy.
Oh.
And I mean, one of the things in your report said was that the government had been far too slow in developing a strategy. Have you any particular reasons, or have you identified any particular reasons as to why? I mean, is it because of the capacity for dealing with some of the waste? Is it because of the fears of what the costs might be, or the knowledge that there just have to be change in people's attitudes? Why do you think they've been slow in reaching that objective?
That is a very interesting question. I don't actually have a clear answer for you. I think that DEFRA are leading on it, and we've now got a task force, haven't we? So with this new government, there has been a renewed interest in it, which we welcome very much. Of course, DEFRA has seen a good number of changes of ministers, secretaries of state over a period of time, and that tends to send departments in different directions if you're not careful. So maybe it's never come up to the top of the priority agenda. But I don't know a specific reason. That doesn't mean there isn't one. Do you, Natalie, know any background to that?
No, I'm afraid I don't. I mean, it's not been reflected in the EIP explicitly when we have a statutory target about reducing residual waste, and of course circular economy is essentially getting to the root cause of why you have excess waste and taking it full circle. New government has made really clear commitments around the circular economy. We're very, very welcoming of that, and we're really pleased with the circular economy task force. We think that it has the right objectives, and we think they're targeting the right kinds of outcomes, but as with many things, what we now need to see them is really getting on and doing it. So I do know that's in train, so to give government full credit that those moves have been made. Why it's taken this long, that I'm afraid I do not have an answer to.
It's an interesting question. Yeah.
But we do know that there is a capacity issue, because we hear the stories in the paper all the time, where waste is collected, it's sorted, and then there's no market for it, and it finishes up being dumped or shipped abroad or whatever. And earlier on you did make the comment about missing targets. And I mean, do you see a danger in setting targets which are unrealistic? They're unrealistic at the very start, but you feel that a bit of public pressure or pressure from groups or lobby groups, so you put them in there, and then you come along later on and condemn the government authorities for not being able to meet targets which probably they shouldn't have set in the first place. And I mean, is there a danger in rushing to having a strategy, if it's a strategy which is not based on realistic ability to deliver? There's no point.
So just on the statutory targets, we were consulted about the statutory targets at the time the then government was trying to agree them, and certainly an amount of time went by while the Secretary of State was actively considering with careful advice where those targets should be set. We were advising, for example, that there should be a statutory target in relation to each of the 10 goals. In the environmental improvement plan, there isn't. There are goals there without an apex target. I find that odd, but you start from somewhere, don't you? we were advising that government should set sufficiently ambitious but achievable goals. And I recollect having a conversation with the then Secretary of State, Therese Coffey, where she was very clear to me that that's exactly what she was going to do, rather than set unachievable goals. We were having a bit of a difference of view about air quality targets as it happened and the time frame for meeting those. So I think that the Secretary of State was trying to walk that line. Now the issue is whether since those targets have been set, enough has been done to try and achieve them. That's our point. It's not that they were not achievable. They were judged to be achievable. The issue is to achieve them. It doesn't just happen. An awful lot has to change. And I think that's been the real problem.
Are there any areas that you believe that there should be priority given? When I think of the context of Northern Ireland, the executive came to a conclusion, look, let's not set unrealistic goals. Let's look for 4 sectors, 4 areas of waste and concentrate on those. Are there any priorities that you feel that the UK government should be setting, or what areas do you believe would be the most advantageous, both in terms of environment and in terms of achievability?
In terms of goal setting or target setting?
Target setting, yeah.
So, as I say, we would argue, for example, the EIP is being refreshed now, isn't it? I'm assuming that the 10 goals will still stand, although they may not, but an assumption is that we've always said they're good goal areas, that each one of them stands on its own right. We hope that they are sustained. I still hold to the view on behalf of the OEP that in each of those areas there should be a statutory target. Now, I'd be surprised if there's going to be, and there may be good reason not, but for me, I think why would you have statutory target in one goal area and not another? It doesn't make sense to me, simplistically. So I would certainly argue for stretching but achievable apex targets in all of those 10 goals. I think there is something to be said at looking again at the interim targets that were set. Some of them are going to be fast upon us, that's no reason to change them. But some of them aren't, in our view, necessarily well aligned to where government's trying to get in relation to its apex target where it's got one. So I think there's a point of alignment there that might be worth looking at.
To move on to another area, and that's the area of chemicals, and you've identified a need for a UK policy and regulatory framework for chemicals. Could you first of all maybe just tell us what are there specific areas and specific issues that have arisen that brought you to that conclusion? And then secondly, if there are, what should be the focus as a priority for the government?
Thank you very much. I'll ask Natalie to deal with that one if I may.
So firstly, we at the OEP are just very much at the beginning of our work looking at chemicals, and it is a huge subject area, and it's something that we have a real interest in, but have to prioritise our interest carefully. We've identified really that chemicals is a significant future threat to biodiversity and nature more generally. It is a really complex area, and it is one that has been impacted by our exit from the EU. The current system hasn't caught up, it's disjointed, it's reactive, and it was designed as an EU level model, and it hasn't caught up here domestically. So what we think government needs to do is really set out for everyone to see, so quite transparently, what its vision is for UK chemicals, so that we can understand it and other stakeholders can understand it. And I think from our perspective, one of the things we are concerned about is in the absence of that, there is a real risk that there will be serious harm caused, and that the resolution of that and the cleaning up of that could be almost unquantifiable in terms of cost. And it's a hazard to the environment, and it's a hazard to human health. Now, we do have an ongoing interest in this, and we are doing some very formative work looking at what an OEP programme focused on chemicals might look like, but that is where we're coming to it at the moment.
Can I say as well, just to follow on from that, I think in our report we deal fairly comprehensively with the situation in relation to chemicals that have been the subject of attention in the past, if you like. But we are also aware that there's a whole range of other chemicals, forever chemicals, for example, forever substances, that are not yet effectively fully identified and regulated. So it seems to me that there's a lot of work to do at the front end on chemicals, and we don't need to know the individual chemicals for that. We need to know the categories of chemicals that we're dealing with and potential causes and potential harms, and see government develop an effective strategy for dealing with those categories.
And have you identified the kind of specific harms that you're concerned about? Because obviously, if you're going to have a regulatory framework, you've got to have identified the harms which you believe that framework needs to deal with. So, can you maybe inform the committee of any of the specific harms that you wish to see the regulations address?
So I think we'd like to write to you about that to get that right. We know, for example, when we use the word chemicals, we can be talking about, I'm thinking particularly about any chemical that gets into a river, a water flow. And I think immediately, of course, about agricultural pollution and the adverse impact that has on human health. But I suspect you'd like more specificity still, and I'd like to write to you about that if I may.
Well, I could, although we haven't done any thematic work yet on chemicals, we did look particularly in our Northern Ireland work on the role of chemicals in particularly driving biodiversity loss. And we don't have a holistic assessment of that, but what we did find is that chemical pollution is affecting biodiversity, but the available evidence as part of that review tended to be localised or species specific or habitat specific. So that doesn't give you a holistic, broader picture, but it does give you plenty of indicators that in Northern Ireland, which is the place we've looked at it specifically, it is having that specific impact. More work would need to be done. As we've suggested, it needs to be taken up to a governmental level.
And that was the next question, really. What do you believe needs to be done to address the gaps and monitoring gaps in relation to chemicals? And how big a problem do you see this, particularly when it comes to PFAS?
I think I'd go back to the answer I've already given. There needs to be a overarching chemical strategy that addresses these issues more systematically. We're not in a position to fill that gap. We are in a position to highlight that it's a real risk, and it is one of those areas where the cost of inaction could significantly outweigh the cost of action, and that's a concern.
Just to conclude on that, if I may, when we're looking at any of these issues, I always start with the three questions: where are we now? Where is government trying to get to, and is it on track to get there? I think with chemicals, we don't know where we are now. Not necessarily OEP's job to find, we've not resourced to do that, but we do ask the question, that there are chemicals here that are simply not monitored. We don't know, and that doesn't seem to be a healthy way for society to be.
Can I take just the last point, and you mentioned you were going to be doing a separate report on Northern Ireland, and obviously we have a unique situation in Northern Ireland insofar as, because we remain in the single market, we're still subject to single market rules, and that means that there are a lot of environmental rules, especially in respect of manufacturing and agriculture, that still apply to Northern Ireland. What difficulties do having the different regulatory regimes or slightly different regulatory regimes cause in your work?
So it's interesting that you asked that, because as we started, we anticipated that it would be a very big difficulty indeed. But in practice it hasn't been so, and that's maybe in part because of the nature of the work that we've done. So, as you may know, decision for us to have responsibility in Northern Ireland was fairly late in the day. The appointment of our board member for Northern Ireland was later than the others. The settlement of our resources for Northern Ireland, was a matter of interesting debate and took an awful long time, and we've never been very happy with it. We've always been very, very clear about that. So in a way, our work in Northern Ireland has necessarily followed behind the work in England to an extent, even the extent of us being able to recruit in Northern Ireland. Although we do now have, I think, about 15 excellent staff, and I'm just so proud of them. They are really, really good people that we've got on our Northern Ireland work. So we then set about, as we've got these staff later than the others, to decide what to do, and we found that at the time there was a political interregnum. Do do you remember?
Yeah, yeah.
So we didn't have a government to engage in, and so, but we also didn't have a real State of the Nation report about the environment in Northern Ireland. So we decided to, rather pragmatically, but I think very sensibly, to do a report on what we thought to be the pressures and drivers affecting the environment in Northern Ireland. And it's a very substantial piece of work. It probably sits alongside our progress reports in terms of size and weight. And we published that last year, and it really is setting out, if you like, where are we now? So we did ask that question generally for Northern Ireland and set it out. And it's really from there that we are now choosing our work programme arising from that. And we haven't actually found that the fact that there is this seeming kind of certainly relationship, if you like, between the European-driven commitments and others that relate to the UK, it hasn't got in our way as yet, has it? Doesn't mean it won't, but it hasn't so far.
If there's, I imagine it will happen over time, regulatory divergence between the rest of the UK and Northern Ireland, does that complicate your work? And do you see where it may complicate your work?
When you say complicate it, we'd have to be aware of it, we'd have to take it into account, and we'd always fall back on the job that we've got, which is to make sure compliance with the law and make sure in Northern Ireland that Northern Ireland does all that it can to meet its aspirations for the environment as set out in your environmental improvement plan. And that's our locus, if you like.
And would different EU targets or goals have implications for you? Because you could be looking at, here's an EU target or goal, here's a UK target or goal, and
I think you're saying welcome to Northern Ireland, aren't you? It's always doubly complicated. It is a different country. We appreciate that.
I think it's just its context, and in reality, the context of the Northern Ireland being part of the island of Ireland, and that the environment disregards borders, generally speaking, is context in terms of our evaluation, because we need to take that into account when we're looking at environmental pressures and drivers in the broader context of change. But at the moment, we haven't experienced a real tension with divergence in Northern Ireland. If that does happen, that will be context that we will deal with as and when that arises.
Could I just add one extra thing which you might be interested in, and that is that we're currently undertaking some research into the potential for regulatory divergence relevant to the environment. We're looking particularly at implications for nutrient management, a big topic for Northern Ireland. Now, it's early days for that research, but we expect to complete it certainly before the summer, and we'll be talking to DARE about that. So we're beginning to dip our toe into the waters that you're interested in. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. Martin Rhodes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to focus on the issue of air quality. It's clear in your report that you see progress there as very much slowing down in terms of, and that's identified as a real problem in terms of the assessment. What do you see as the crucial factors that actually have led to that slowing down?
That's an interesting question, thank you. So, obviously there have been some improvements in air quality because of changes that occurred before our time. Changes in fuel, for example, have made a very big difference, which we are all benefiting from. But we have found that things have levelled off of late, and there are a couple of things we particularly draw attention to in our report. One is that the accountability and transparency framework has been weakened. So there were provisions related to the National Air Pollution Control Programme where actually we did commend government in, I think, our first report for delivering well there, doing a proper assessment of progress and gaps, and that's just gone now. And that seems just to be a weakening of governance and accountability, and it means less likely that things are going to be picked up early and acted on. But also there are now, the next challenge, if you like, is to address air pollutants across key sectors such as road transport, for example, and agriculture. And they are going to be trickier, they need to be tackled. And at the same time, we're seeing reduced support here for local authorities, when local authorities carry a lot of responsibility actually day to day for air quality in their areas. So these are the things that affected our assessment of progress.
So, in terms of those factors that you've highlighted there, am I right in saying that it falls into sort of two categories? One is essentially some things were easier anyway at the beginning, which made things go quicker at the beginning, and then there was also going to be more trickier things.
Impact at the beginning.
Yeah. And then the other element of is to do with actual government in terms of, you mentioned in terms of accountability and transparency, you mentioned support for local authorities. So there's two elements to this in terms of these factors. One is actually just the nature of the problem. Some things are easier to deal with than others, and some things are trickier. But it's also about government's role as well.
It is. So it's getting more difficult, to make the progress that's needed, but it's still needed. Mm-hmm. There are tens of thousands of deaths in this country that relate directly back to poor air quality. So it's not a nice to have in our book, but these things are more difficult and they cost money, and they also require government to deal with some really tricky issues, not just in difficulty, but in terms of the nature of them. So, for example, tyre and brake wear, and the 2.5s that come off that, and also dealing with intensive beef and dairy farming and some of the emissions from there, and also the spread of non-manure digestate, for example. These are things that may be politically difficult. So it's really requiring a hike up now.
Mm-hmm.
We've got the easy territory done, now there's a hill, so let's get up it. Yeah.
So, in effect, the nature of the issue in terms of that move from dealing with easier things to the more difficult things, actually what's required from your point of view is actually greater government commitment in the area. Yeah. And in terms of the recommendations, the specific recommendations that you make around air quality, the three of them, why have you highlighted those particular three in terms of the report?
So our general approach, if you like, is to analyse all the available evidence we've got, and we've got our own experts to do that, and we've got quite a large body of experts now that we can call upon as well. So we're doing our best to actually work out how things are, and then we are always trying to find the change, the recommendation that will have the most impact. We're trying to work out the most impact. And in very general terms, government can often sort of decide something will make a difference to a specific thing, but we want difference across the board, don't we? So often our recommendations are at that strategic level where we want differences across the board. So that's where we are in relation to the two recommendations we made here. One is to actually make up for the gap, if you like, that was created by getting rid of the accountability that we once had. It seems to us really important to do that. And then the second is to review the legal standards set. So there's some conflict here, isn't there, about what the standard should be.
Mm-hmm.
But we've got the standards we've got. Europe's getting ahead of us. Do we want that? Because we ought to be able to keep abreast, in our view.
So in terms of those recommendations and framing them, it's in terms of making that balance between things where you can make a bigger impact, but keeping that broader approach that you're talking about. What is the balance there in terms of that you need the government in terms of government's role, in terms of their commitment? Is it about seeing things which are particularly difficult and therefore putting more resource into that? Or is it about how, in terms of measuring the potential impact of those changes?
And this is about how our approach is to. So we're doing the analysis, as I say, trying to see where we need to get to. We're looking for things with the biggest impact. We are also looking at the nearness of statutory targets and the achievability of statutory. We want to see that trajectory is there, so we take that into account as well. We are also trying, as far as we can, with the abilities we have, to look at the tipping points that are coming up in a particular environmental area. And some of those are marine, for example, is extremely worrying for me in that respect. But I have to say, with all our effort, and there's a good deal of effort and cross-checking with experts and so on, there is inevitably a large amount of judgment in what we choose to recommend. It's also true to say that the more we know, the more we look, the more confidence we get. The same cross-cutting issues keep appearing. And you'll see those reflected in our key recommendations right at the front of the report, not those relating to specific goals, but the key recommendations. You know, they are relevant to every goal area. And that's because we've learnt that from actually looking. It wasn't the thought that we started with, it's what we've ended up with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, just on that, you steered clear, I think, unless you were so subtle I didn't see it, of talking about ULEZ in the context of air quality. Now, one of the things that changed between 2022, 23 and 23, 24 was the politics of this. In the run-up to that, there was a lot of push from the previous Conservative government, particularly when Boris Johnson was the leader, towards the ULEZ kind of approach. We then had the Uxbridge by-election, and the previous Conservative government thought opposition to ULEZ might be a vote winner. We then saw various sort of local politicians, mayors or potential mayors, sort of stepping back from introducing those schemes. I mean, do you think that has been in any way significant to the much less positive outlook on air quality in 23-24 compared to 22-23?
Well, I'm not in a position to be definitive about that, but what we do know, I think, and experts will correct me if I've got this wrong, but air quality, when you measure it across the nation, you know, it's not bad, but a lot of the nation isn't occupied. When you look at where you've got particularly poor air quality, it tends to be in urban areas where population is dense. So when you look at the effect on individuals in the population, there's a greater effect, isn't there, where air quality is poor. So the way you make the most difference to the health of the nation is by tackling the pollution in the most densely populated areas. Makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah. I'm not quite sure if that was a yes or a no to my question. Do you believe that the sort of political move against ULEZ has been significant to that more detrimental finding this year compared to last year or not?
Well, I don't think it actually has affected it for the assessment of the year to March 24. That's when our assessment was running.
Okay.
Yeah. And you know, the information we've got on air quality, you know, it's of a certain date as well. It's not that we've got up to the minute data, so I'm not really able to answer, but I understand the point you're making.
Yeah, you wouldn't commit to that. No, fair enough. Anna Golden.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just briefly return to something you touched on there, where you talked about tipping points, and I think you were saying that you were particularly concerned about marine environment tipping points. Did you want to expand upon that briefly?
So you have an inquiry yourself on the governance of marine. You've had some very interesting evidence given to you in that respect, and I know you have a particular interest in it as well. So, but it seems to us that, well, we are a sea nation. We're an island surrounded by sea. We ought to be able to look after those seas. Very little is actually protected, and everything seems to take an awful long time in marine. And that's what, I'm not an environmentalist, as you know, but that's what I see, that decades go by, and everything is like in a slow motion in marine. So I think you mentioned earlier the issue about activities within protected areas that shouldn't be happening. They're still happening. You know, what is that? And the evidence that you've had already, that you've been given, is telling you that it's not that there isn't policy, although we argue that the marine strategy is a bit ragged and, you know, it needs to be a much more solid affair. It's about delivery, isn't it? So it worries me that we've got good scientists, but we've not necessarily got all of the monitoring data that we want. I worry about what we don't know. And I worry about what's happening that we're not dealing with. In the context that global sea temperatures are rising at a surprising rate.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful, and my series of questions are around some of those priority areas, so we may come back onto that. And so you've advised the government on its rapid review of the current environmental improvement plan. What are the most crucial updates needed to the plan to keep England on track with its environmental commitments?
So government has said it wants to review this plan, and it wants to strip out extraneous material and focus on meeting the statutory targets. I think that's my understanding broadly of what's been trying to be achieved here. It seems to us really, well, there's plenty of extraneous material, there's plenty of repetition actually in the existing one. You could reduce the 600 commitments to 400 and you wouldn't have actually made a change to what the commitment is. So there's a fair amount of extraneous stuff to be pulled out. I do want to see those 10 goals preserved, and I've mentioned before, it'd be really good to see some apex targets or statutory targets in relation to those. But for us, it is all about delivery now. So we want to see, yes, those interim targets aligned properly to those statutory targets. That would be good. We've said before, I think, in any number of reports, that getting nature-friendly farming right is just now so significant across the commitments to nature. So that's about increased spatial prioritisation. It's about formal guidance and advice to farmers. It's about increasing uptake in the more environmentally ambitious aspects of, for example, the countryside stewardship scheme. So, and now that's all sitting alongside the prospect of a land use framework as well, isn't it, where landowners have a big part to play. So it's really important for us that that is pressed home and pursued to a maximum. Then I've mentioned already protected sites for nature. I know it's difficult to get someone who owns a protected site to look after it well, but it's not impossible to incentivise it, so I'd like to see that. We've talked about speeding up action in the marine environment, and we could talk more about it if you wish. Competing demands for use of land and sea, well, we've got, progress needs to be made there, we've got the land use framework. I'm not sure we're in quite the same place in relation to competing demands for sea, so seeing some more progress there. We've spoken about the need to develop a circular economy framework. Let's see that as well. And then there are some cross-cutting issues which we would press home particularly. So, for example, regulating effectively. We have a real opportunity now, post-Brexit. We have some regulatory freedoms that we didn't have. We may not be as experienced in regulating the environment as we need to be, but we need to really build our muscles now and get to grips with the detail of that to deliver what's actually required. So I'll stop there, but those are the sort of things we are looking for in a revised environmental improvement plan.
It's really helpful overview, and there's lots of different areas there, particularly difficult to prioritise when there's so many important priorities, and I really appreciate that contribution. And your response to the rapid review interim findings emphasised the need to prioritise those with the greatest impact across environmental improvement plan goal areas. So how does the OEP define impact, and how can the government ensure it's focusing on those most effective actions?
So, to deal with the last half of your question first, we try and get government to focus on those in any number of ways. So, in the report and recommendations that we make, in the formal advice we give to government, and in the informal advice that we're able to give to government in specific meetings we have with ministers and officials, for example. So, we're using any number of ways in which to get these messages across. How we decide impact, well, it's not so different to how we decide prioritisation. It is about having the largest possible impact, and often that is by addressing these cross-cutting issues in our view. I think I've spoken a bit about that already in this hearing, but it is about, these are the big tools that government has. Elms, for example, it's probably the biggest lever, so pull it.
There's something else as well I think that's really important in terms of consistency of our recommendations, and it sounds simple, but we really need to see firm delivery plans, and because in the absence of those delivery plans, it's very, very difficult to quantify what effort in what place is meant to deliver what outcome. And a lot of the current EIP isn't cast in terms of outcomes, it's cast in terms of outputs. Now, I appreciate that's a bit management speak, but there's a big difference between I'm going to do X and I'm going to achieve Y. Now, we don't want perfect to be the enemy of the good, but it is really important the government can set out which of its policies it's relying on and how far it expects those to take it. And that's really important, not just from our perspective. It would certainly make our job a lot easier in terms of assessing effectiveness, but it allows ENGOs, it allows DEFRA delivery bodies, it allows the general public and others to really understand how things are meant to fit together. And it also gives us the greatest opportunity, if we see things going off track, both to identify that they're off track and for them to come back on track, because it is a complex business, of course it is. It's not straightforward, and we've talked a lot today about the intersection of so many different strategies and policies and how you need to join them all together, and that is very difficult to do. But I think it would be a big step forward if we had transparent delivery plans, even if there were still gaps and areas of work to be done on that. I think that would be fine to do, because it is difficult to nail it down, and I really hope that that's what we see in the new EIP.
Or to accompany the new EIP. You know, the one isn't much good without the other.
Yeah, thank you. Very helpful.
Chris Hinchcliffe.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to be focusing my questions on the role of the OEP's enforcement. To return very briefly to the WWF Client Earth nitrogen issue, just to reiterate what we discussed before, concern raised in November 2022, investigation, as I understand it, launched in November 2024. You referred to mitigating circumstances for that timeline, but given that ecological damage is so often cumulative, the faster we can respond, the better. What can be done to accelerate these processes?
So if I can just start by just reiterating quickly the component parts there. We were still building our investigation muscle as a new organisation, still recruiting. We were having difficulties which we were quite transparent about in terms of cooperation with DEFRA at the time. You know, it was extremely difficult, and testing our mettle to the limit. And then we were waiting for a very relevant court decision when we weren't quite sure when it was coming. So there were some factors there. But Natalie, you'll want to deal with the substance now of this particular complaint and where we are now.
Well, actually, sorry, can I just interrupt that? I'm not totally, I don't want to focus on the specifics of the case. What I want to focus on generally, having learned from that, we've spoken before about that timeline not being acceptable. Generally, what can be done to accelerate that process is notwithstanding the mitigating circumstances you've just outlined.
So I would suggest that case is an outlier in relation to our cases, and because of some very specific circumstances. But I'm not going to defend the timeline, it was too long. It just was. I think that's absolutely fair criticism. I think if you look at the volume of our complaints and investigations over the last 2 years, you can see a real maturing in pace there, both in terms of the volume of investigations and cases we've taken forward and their complexity. And we have been and have taken quite decisive action in a number of cases. So I'll give us some examples. Our investigation into the authorisation of neonicotinoid, I'm stumbling over it. Yeah. I practiced as well, neonicotinoid use, which we do think has been really material in informing government policy. Our investigation into the regulation of combined sewer overflows, which has taken 2 years, but is an enormous investigation, which goes into the permitting of every CSO in England, where we're at a decision notice stage, which is almost the final stage in that case, and 2 concluded investigations in Northern Ireland, where in both cases we achieved a positive outcome and resolution of the underlying environmental issues. So I think as we've been operational in this sphere for about 2.5 years, I think we've learned an enormous amount, both in terms of the pace at which we take cases forward, but also how we work really closely with public authorities to achieve resolution. So I don't believe, given the improvements we've built in and the learning that we've done, that we will see a repeat of the kinds of delays that we saw in that case. Okay,
but the answer actually is in fact no further recommendations on improving the processes, for example, in how you're working with government on the enforcement process.
I think we always want to do better, and I think the job that we have to do is a very complicated one. There's very few, we don't replicate the same issue over again, and each of them has our own unique dynamic. So I think it's incumbent on us to keep improving what we do and test and challenge ourselves regularly. So I don't think that's the case. I do think that we have improved substantially how we work with the public authorities, and that's not just down to us. That is also in recognition that the public authorities we routinely engage with, DEFRA is the most prominent one, which is unsurprising given how many environmental duties they're subject to. I think it has matured significantly. And I think that's very important because ultimately we don't want to be taking public authorities to court. It costs a lot of money and it's very slow and it's not necessarily the best way to achieve the best outcome for the environment. And so having the ability to have really good ongoing dialogue, particularly on these really deep, intractable problems like regulation of CSOs, and as I anticipate, achieving good ecological status in the marine environment, that it is not a simple thing. So I think we will continue to learn, and I'm very pleased with the progress that we've made, but I think it's quite right that we should be challenged, including by this committee, on our performance.
If I may just say, we reviewed our strategy and enforcement policy late last year. We did make some changes to our enforcement policy to reflect our learning. Secondly, we've launched 8 investigations, I think, so far, but in 16 other cases, we've got to a very good resolution without launching that formal step. And the details are on our website, and I'm very pleased with that. That's where we want to get to, change, to bring things in line without the expense, public expense of taking proceedings. Just to give you an example of how we ourselves have improved. So initially, when we were making information requests to DEFRA or any other department, but predominantly DEFRA, as we can, in the legislation that we operate under, we were perhaps drawing those too broadly. DEFRA was wondering what on earth we were doing, and we have, with DEFRA, changed that process materially so that we have a good conversation with the relevant people about not just what we're looking for, but why, and we can together agree what is relevant, and then that can be delivered. So I think that's a very good example where, through bitter experience, actually, we have learnt to do things better on our part.
Okay, thank you. To look at some of the other specific cases then, could you talk to us about what led the OEP to step in on the Rights Community Action court case about MHCLG's duty to consider the environmental principles policy statement, and what you've learnt from this and other court cases?
Absolutely. I didn't mention in my introduction that we have the power to intervene in cases, and we've intervened in 3 so far, that being one of them. We have the approach that we take is generally we do not take a view on the subject matter of the case itself, so we haven't taken any view at all on the particular decision in that particular case. We do look at cases, and they tend to be in the appellate court, but they've all been in either the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court. We look where a case has implications for a wider understanding of environmental law. That was certainly the case in the Finch Supreme Court case, which we intervened in. In this particular case, it relates to how public authorities should use the environmental principles policy statement. Now, we have a very keen interest in how the EPPS is used. We think it's a very powerful tool for environmental protection. And in that case, the court decided, the High Court decided, that the EPPS could effectively be applied retrospectively. Now, we are concerned that that's an incorrect interpretation of the legal duty, quite apart from the facts of that particular case, and that obviously has implications for how the EPPS is used by all of the rest of government. What we want to do when we do interventions is to assist the court by providing our own expert view on what the law requires, and that's what we've done in that particular case. Now, of course, we await the court's judgment on that particular one.
Okay, thank you. And we've had a few references to the marine environment already. Could you tell us a little bit more about what prompted the OEP's investigation into DEFRA's duty to achieve good environmental status in the marine environment, and what the key areas of concern that you have identified are?
We commenced a piece of work looking at marine about a year ago, and we did a widespread call for evidence. And what came out of that call for evidence was a particular concern about whether government had achieved the 2020 marine target. Now, we'll all recognise that 2020 was 4 years ago, but it is an apex primary environmental target, and we've explained already what our keen interest is in those targets. Now, government was due to publish an assessment of whether it viewed that it had met that target at the back end of 2024, and we were waiting to see whether that was forthcoming. Now, that has not been forthcoming, and given that there is a very reasonable view that that target may have been missed. And the reason I'm circumspect about it is that the test for whether a target has been met is, of course, multiple tests, and it's a complex assessment. But a very real concern that target had been missed, and actually government had not put forward how it was going to, well, either whether it accepted that it had been missed and what it was then going to do. And so we decided to commence an investigation. And now we think that this particular investigation will have broader utility than just looking specifically at the marine target, although we are very concerned about the marine target. But we really want to explore what it requires government to do to meet a target, and that's to help both us and government understand ahead of subsequent apex targets what legal responsibilities exist. So both of those factors were key in our decision to commence that investigation.
Could I add as well that we, in shaping up our marine programme of work, we did a call for evidence, an extensive call for evidence, and we listened to what we were told, and we were particularly interested in the 15 measures that describe, if you like, good environmental status, and what the prospects we thought they were of government achieving more than a handful of those measures, and that was particularly influential.
Okay, thank you very much. And then finally, following the OEP's recent warnings to DEFRA and Ofwat regarding unlawful sewage discharges, what are the next steps that you are pursuing, and what impact do you expect the OEP intervention to have?
Just to help put that into a little bit of context, we have a number of stages in an investigation. So we launch an investigation, then we issue something called an information notice, which essentially sets out where we think government may have broken the law. There is a response to that. We take that into account. Then we issue something called a decision notice, which is where we make a statement that we, the OEP, believe the law has been broken. Government and public authorities have a right to respond to that decision notice. The stage we're at the moment is that we issued decision notices to the Secretary of State for the Environment, Ofwat and the Environment Agency with our view that they had broken the law. The stage we're at the moment is that we have had responses from all of the relevant organisations to that decision notice, and we have a choice to be made. And I have to be circumspect here because, as with so many things, this is a live investigation. So there are a number of things that could now happen. Depending on our view on the responses, we could conclude the investigation. If we do that, we will issue something called an investigation report where we will set out clearly to everybody the conclusion of the matter, our view on whether we maintain our view around breach of the law. And the circumstances where we might do that may well be where public authorities have put forward a plan of remediative steps that in our view addresses the underlying consequences of the breach. That's one potential outcome. The other potential outcome is that we are not satisfied either that the issues have been addressed, and if that happens, we would move to commence an environmental review, which is very similar to a judicial review, where we would put the matter before a court, ask the court to determine the law in question, and ask the court then to determine remedy, which again would be rectification steps. Now, we believe the best way to resolve these issues is through dialogue and a mutually agreed outcome, because in our view that is the quickest way to get to a sensible resolution. We will have to make decisions on this particular case and others like it in due course, but it will be one of those two outcomes.
Just to push very, very briefly, and I understand if you can't answer that, you've mentioned in due course. Are you able to tell us what due course would mean when a decision on your conclusions would be possible?
I'm not going to tell you a particular date, not least because I will have to take that to our board, who have the decision reserved to our board, and they sometimes follow my recommendations and sometimes do not follow my recommendations. But I would say that we are at a very advanced stage of discussion with those public authorities. So I say due course a little bit euphemistically. I don't expect it to be a very long time, but it would be a mistake for me to give you a particular deadline.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair.
Ellie Chant.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses. I've got some questions for you regarding resources. First of all, on staffing. I don't know, perhaps Natalie first, and then Glenys, if you want to add anything. So I understand a previous Secretary of State capped the maximum number of staff that the OEP can have. I understand there's a headcount cap of 65 full-time equivalents. And so I'm interested to know, does that cap affect your ability to fulfil your statutory duties as set for you by Parliament?
certainly affects how efficient we can be in trying to fulfil our duties. The total amount of resource we get affects us as well. You know, with 20 more staff, we'd make a lot more difference. You know, that's the case we make. For that puny investment, you would get so much more as a government and parliament. But it's true that the headcount cap has made it difficult to be as efficient as we could otherwise be. But Natalie, you'll want to come in on the detail.
Okay. So firstly, that cap only applies in England. We don't have a headcount cap in Northern Ireland. It has caused problems for us, and in particular, we operate a flexible resourcing model, and it has at times hampered our ability to make sure we've got the right people in the right places doing the right kind of work, and that's regardless of our overall resourcing envelope. So we could accommodate much more flexibility within the resourcing envelope that we had. Now my understanding is that the new government has been very, very receptive to removing that cap. That would be very welcome. It would allow us to resource ourselves in the most efficient way possible, and that would be a benefit to us. I think it would be unlikely that we would actually be able to grow any larger than we are now, even with the cap removed, because of the broader fiscal context, but perhaps we'll get onto that in due course.
Indeed, and you've in a way slightly preempted that, but it sounds like you'd be very you would very warmly receive a potential recommendation from this committee, perhaps, that the headcount cap is removed itself, because it sets an administrative restriction on your ability to use the resources that you do have to maximum effect. So moving on to that kind of wider question about the resources that you have available to you, the funding allocated to the OEP, is it sufficient in both England and, you know, in Northern Ireland? Which perhaps you'd like to respond on those two jurisdictions separately.
So if I can just start first of all and then get to the detail with Natalie, but our position is that we're still a young organisation. You know, we started on the notion that we would start with 50 staff, but that wouldn't be the end of it. You don't just create an organisation out of thin air, and if you try and do it too quickly, you know, you've got lots of people running around not really knowing what their jobs are. And there's a design to build and job descriptions to build and line management and so on. So we were ready to set up with 50, but we've always said we needed more. There's certainly a lot of work being done before the OEP was created. Within DEFRA, work was done to assess our needs. It was thought to be between about 80 and 120 staff. You know, various commitments were made by various ministers and others in Parliament and elsewhere, but the fact is we haven't got those sorts of numbers, but we estimate we need those sorts of numbers. Our argument is that we are a fledgling organisation. We're not fully fledged, that we can take a hit like others can. We're still trying to grow to what we should have been, you know, at the start. So from my point of view, you know, we need an extra couple of million, I think, in England, and, you know, maybe 20 staff. But it would enable us to do some things that you expect of us. For example, doing a really good job being able to predict the trajectory of progress in relation to key statutory targets. We could get much better at that, and that would help Parliament and help government to know earlier and more precisely what the trajectory is looking like. It seems to us that's what we're supposed to be doing. You know, it's certainly what we can do under our legislation, but we are restrained at the moment because we just simply don't have the resource to do it. Northern Ireland's another matter, but perhaps you'll come on to that, Natalie, once you've dealt with the detail of where we are in terms of money.
We've, over the last several rounds of spending review, modelled what we think the organisation needs to be effective. We put the number at about 100 staff, which is about in the middle of DEFRA's original model. We're actually running at just under 80, and that covers both England and Northern Ireland, so both jurisdictions. So in England we've got about 65, so that's a good bit short of the original model. We've bid, we think our annual funding should be just shy of about 13 million. That's for England and Northern Ireland, so about 10.5 in England. Our current funding is about 8.8 in England and 1.9 for Northern Ireland. So there is a shortfall. In looking at our future plans, we are having to be very rigorous in our business planning. We've seen, for example, in 2024, we've seen an uptick of about 45% in numbers of complaints. We're seeing a similar sort of uptick in the number of contacts we're getting from members of the public. About 60% of those contacts relate to potential breaches of law by public authorities, not all eligible to become complaints for various reasons. We think with our portfolio of 5 investigations that we're at maximum capacity right now. And we are having to make the kinds of choices to make sure that we can deliver on the things that we must do. We must do our annual progress report, and we must handle complaints and investigations. That's increasingly squeezing out our capacity to do very much else. And so we don't think that we were ever funded to the level that we should have been. Now we run a very efficient and lean organisation, and we constantly focus on that. And we have built in our abilities to flex, both flex our human resources and our other resources. We've got a very flexible operating model within the organisation, and we've built mechanisms so that we can really focus on the things that we think matter the most. But I think increasingly that will mean areas that we would like to invest more time and capacity, and we won't be able to. So, for example, this year, I would like to do focus work on soils, chemicals and waste. I can probably take one of those 3 programmes forward because I can't fund the others. So that's the real implications of the funding. But we do recognise the broader fiscal situation that the government faces. We do recognise that, but we have been very consistent in what we think an appropriate funding model should be for the organisation.
And within the broader fiscal situation, these are not huge sums of money that we're talking about. In terms of your budget, but potentially really significant impact. Just picking up on that, I mean, I understand that you gave evidence to the predecessor committee to this one a year ago, where you called attention particularly to kind of the limitations on the capacity of the complaints and investigation team to handle new cases, and you've just said that you've seen a 45% uptick in complaints. So, how are you managing that, managing the prioritisation? The implication, I suppose, is that there is a lot of significant work that you should be doing that falls directly within your statutory remit, but is simply having to be left aside because the government has not provided sufficient resources to enable you to do the very important job that you're supposed to.
If I may turn to complaints and investigations, at the moment I would say that we are at but not beyond capacity, but I think our ability to expand our current portfolio is I think we're at the limit of that. And obviously we can't predict what's going to come across our desk. We just can't. It's the nature of what we do. We do have in our enforcement policy, we set out how we prioritise cases. So there is a hierarchy, and we do put cases through that hierarchy, and we look particularly at where are the most substantive issues, where's the greatest impact, where do we think our interest and our attention will make a meaningful, positive contribution to the environment. Dame Glenys regularly says we're not nitpickers. We're definitely not nitpickers. We're very selective in the cases that we take forward. But yes, I am concerned that we will have to make some very difficult choices around what cases we take forward. And that is saying that we preserve capacity to do that, because that is a core part of what we have to do. Where I think it really starts to bite is around our more thematic work, which we know adds real value, but it's area we have more discretion there to not take forward areas of work. So I know I gave, for the example, chemicals, waste and soil. These are areas that our board have over time shown real interest in. The quality of our soils is an absolutely critical enabling factor, and it is an area which is often neglected and attention not sufficiently paid to it. We know that there are really material pressures in the waste sector, including how that's regulated. And I've already talked today about the threat of chemicals, and I know many in the sector, it keeps them awake at night. Now, in an ideal world, I would like to commence more programmes of work that are exploratory, so that we can really delve into those areas and have the evidence base to scrutinise them a lot more closely. And I think we will, but I will have to stagger that work programme. And that's where it's really biting.
Might be helpful to recognise as well that we never start an investigation without the board agreeing. So the recommendation comes to the board and is presented in the wider context of the business for the year. So it's not that our executives have free rein to load up investigations, you know, at the cost of everything else. And it's the same with these interventions that we've made to the court as well. Your colleague was asking about one or two of those earlier, and again, each of those has been authorised by our board, recognising that, you know, there was a pattern emerging. We had a number at the back end of last year, and we considered each one individually and in the context of the others, but they were right, they were appropriate for intervention. And maybe that's partly because we're at the stage we're at post-Brexit, you know, giving the courts a chance to really shape our laws. But we're always aware that every time we authorise one of those hard-edged pieces of work, as I call them, an intervention or an investigation, it's at a cost to the other thematic work. And we're trying to strike a balance, but it's not getting any easier. You know, as we become more aware of this, we get more inquiries, more investigations, people get more confident about seeking our advice in relation to the interpretation of the law. It does squeeze out things if we're not careful, and it's a worry to me.
Thank you.
Pippa Hayland.
Yes, thank you. So your report into progress towards the improvement of the natural environment, you know, it's kind of worrying for many people because it shows that we're still off track in terms of our targets. Your final recommendation is one that you've alluded to quite a little bit here, which is about leadership in government in terms of taking a cross-departmental approach, because as you've been talking about, the multiple types of use in land and sea use are the drivers of habitat loss and environmental pollution, and therefore this cross-departmental approach is absolutely critical. And I want to ask you a main key question around this. Now, within the report, it's not so explicit. There's sort of this inextricable relationship between the climate and nature emergencies. And following the recent Climate and Nature Bill debate, the Secretary of State committed to an annual climate and nature statement to Parliament and the country. And perhaps this is an opportunity for the statement that we've been talking about here that should come before Parliament, and hopefully that will be based on the reports that you provide. What recommendations do you think this committee would make? Because the Secretary of State to this committee affirmed his desire to seek guidance in terms of what format that statement should take.
Oh, right.
And therefore, what recommendations would you think this committee should make in terms of how the delivery of climate and nature targets should be better aligned?
Right. I think I'd like to think about that and write to you about it. It seems a great opportunity, and I'd like to sort of get the detail of that right. I do think there are some promising signs lately of the sort of join up that's been lacking. So it is interesting that the proposals in relation to development and nature that are coming in relation to planning reform, there's been obviously been very close liaison between DEFRA and MHCLG in relation to those proposals, and we welcome that. Indeed, we did write to both relevant Secretaries of State, I think, just yesterday in relation to what's proposed there. But I think it's quite promising, don't you, that you're seeing something that is being branded and coming out from the two departments. We've never seen that before. So I think there are some promising signs of join up, which I think is what we needed. There's not much in the governance framework for this, though, that requires it.
Yes.
We've made this point before. Mm-hmm. So DEFRA leads on the environment, of course it does. And there's a cross-government board at director level, and that's very useful to have. But more could be hardwired. And we've said that before, that really governance across government could be strengthened. Of course, we've now got the EPPS, and it seems to us that's a really useful tool if it's applied purposefully very early on, and if it is amended to embed the targets in it. The statutory targets and the EIP aren't referenced in it at the moment, so the tool itself can get strengthened, and then we can be sure that it is applied equally well across all departments. And there are some good exemplars at the moment, that we've seen, and we're reporting on that. But let's see good quality work everywhere. There's some big things coming up, aren't there? Energy infrastructure, third runway, whatever. There's real opportunities to let's see that EPPS properly applied, and let's be transparent about it. we can see that the environment is really properly considered. But could we write to you about the requests that you make? Because I'd really like a chance to consider it.
I think it's a huge opportunity.
Yes,
the fact that it could also be a national conversation, and you've mentioned that, in fact, perhaps one of the problems is that environment doesn't have a voice. And this could be a start where we make sure that it has a voice in decision making. You've mentioned, the land use frame, but there's obviously at a different time, it's staggered. There's the strategic spatial energy plan. So these are, both these are things that need to be linked. But Natalie, perhaps with you, it's about delivery now, isn't it? So how do you have interoperability, perhaps, between, for example, our carbon budget and the delivery around that, and our environmental improvement plan? Are we speaking to each other in the delivery plans?
Someone needs to run a conference on that, don't you think? 2-day conference would get us somewhere. Yeah.
I do think, and I think sometimes this gets forgotten, that the environmental improvement plan is government's environmental improvement plan. It's not DEFRA's environmental improvement plan, and the targets are government's targets, and they're not DEFRA's targets, and they may be the lead organisation. But my perspective on it is that many other departments have to play an important role. Our Department for Transport, obviously in housing. I actually think there's huge opportunities in the Department for Health as well. And I do recognise that there is a cross-government board, and I hope that is bringing that thinking together. But I do think I really would like to see all of those departments really embracing their own responsibilities, including the departments with big estates. So Department for Education, big influence over school estate. Ministry of Justice has got big influence over the prisons and broader estate, and not just in terms of their contribution to delivering those outcomes, but also as recipients of benefits of recovery of nature. And I think if we can start positioning and thinking about nature recovery not as something that we just have to invest in, but as something that delivers really good returns. And I think if we can have that, particularly in those other departments, that they can see that paying a full contribution to achieving targets and delivering the IP will deliver returns for them and their own policy agendas as well. And I think that would be a very different kind of conversation.
So we bring the conversation we're having in climate, which is co-benefits, we bring that as well into the nature sphere and natural capital. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Julia Buckley.
So we're moving on now to the policy statement and the legal duty. So the legal duty to have regard to the EIP has been enforced since November 23, but is there evidence that the benefits have been embedded effectively in DEFRA and across the government as a whole, or can you tease out maybe some examples where you think it's not really making that impact?
So the Environmental Principles Policy Statement, I think, is one of the most important tools. If we can get it applied well, it's a win-win, isn't it, for DEFRA and wider government. So we've shown a very keen interest in it right from the very beginning. What we can see actually is that, in our view, DEFRA has done a pretty good job actually in launching it across government and in providing some good guidance and support tools to do that, and hats off to them for that. It's what was required, and broadly they've done it, so that's very good. We've also found it rather difficult to get actual evidence of how well it's being applied. There's no requirement for government or departments to be transparent about that. So that's one interesting factor for us, actually trying to find out how it's being applied. We do have come across some good examples of how it's been applied. I was thinking about the Department for Transport, for example, where that's a department that's come to us to seek engagement with us, which is so welcome, to actually talk things through. So we know there are some good examples of how it's being applied. We do have concerns about whether it's being applied early enough in relation to some work, but we can't tell them, but we're flagging that up. We should do that. And there are areas in which we think the Environmental Principles Policy Statement itself needs to be strengthened. So, as one example, I think I've mentioned already, it doesn't actually reference the statutory targets, whereas it'd be very helpful if it did, to make sure that people are very focused on specifically what government is setting out by statute to achieve.
So what would help us, if you wouldn't mind writing into this committee with that list of those areas where you think those gaps are? That would be incredibly helpful to us.
We have got a full report as well, which I don't know whether we've sent that ahead of, we have, yeah. But certainly we can summarise that for you, no problem at all.
But do you have any particular concerns either where you think it hasn't made a difference, where you think it's not yet cut through?
Early days, isn't it, for that?
I think it's early days, and I mean, we'll lay our report before Parliament, and I'm sure you'll have a keen interest in it. I think there are a number of areas where it could be more fulsomely embedded, and we make those recommendations in our report. We decided to look at the implementation of EPPS early on because we thought the opportunity to really embed it came early, and therefore our assessment is obviously a little bit tentative. Because it is in the very, very early days of the implementation. But we will not be moving away from the EPS. We will continue to pay close attention to it. And also in Northern Ireland, as the Northern Ireland EPPS is being rolled out, slightly behind the English one, but we've got a continued ongoing programme looking at it. And we will report regularly on how it's going.
I think that's quite timely, isn't it? Because DEFRA are undertaking this review of the cross-government implementation, and they say that should be finished this summer. So what do you think that should entail, and is there a particular output that you're hoping to see?
Well, what that entails is frankly a matter for DEFRA. We don't know what is anticipated there. I'm quite keen to see what it is. But we know from the work we've done, what we think needs to change, and we've set that out in our report. Now, if DEFRA came to the same conclusions, that would be a happy coincidence for us. But I think we have to wait and see.
And do you agree with that, Ms. Prosser?
I do.
Okay, then the last round of questions from me really is around the public investment. So your recent report assessment suggests that government should generate funds for public investment through application of the polluter pays principle. I find that really interesting. I was this morning guesting on the EFRA committee where we were interviewing all the the private water companies who all have been fined, but some of those fines haven't been paid and people want to know where the money's gone. So I'm really interested in your view on this. What are the best opportunities to extract this polluter pays principle to pay for some of this investment?
So I'm not sure we've done sufficient work on that to advise you well. Again, I'd like the opportunity to consider that, if I may. We certainly haven't covered it fulsomely in this report here. So could I come back to you on that? I think it's a pertinent question, and I think there is a lot of confusion about polluter pays, which isn't helpful. So if I could come back on it, I'd appreciate it.
Can I just clarify if we're talking about, for example, the reinvestment of water company fines, or whether we're talking...
So just an example, please.
Okay, you're talking more broadly.
More broadly
around
where
through using regulation to...
Where it could potentially make a
difference.
Incentivise
behaviour change.
Yeah. Okay.
That's helpful.
It's a stimulating question. We'll come back to you.
When we were on the EU withdrawal bill, we didn't, we were supposed to sort of actually bring the polluter pays principle, because we don't have principles in UK legislation, so we couldn't absolutely directly bring in the polluter pays principle. No. So therefore it had to then come in
a back door, yeah.
And so it's about how do we make sure that's fully in there and implementable, and it can be a recourse.
Okay.
I think it's a key moment. As a committee, we're often interviewing organisations like yourself whose job is around regulation, and we're usually sharing joint frustration around enforcement not being as quick as we would like or as forceful as we would like. And I think that this, fines and the incentivisation can perhaps be a thing that will move this up people's agenda and add those teeth. So I think it has a real role to play, joining up enforcement and regulation to get behaviour change quicker. So I think it could be a real key moment for you to help us with some good recommendations that we can feed in.
I'm sure we'll do whatever we can. Thank you. Just add that to the list of...
You've gone away with a long to-do list. Thank you. Back to you, Stacey.
Thank you very much. This committee obviously has a role across government investigating and scrutinising the work of government. We see our intentions as very much complementary to yours, so you can be assured that this committee stands ready to support the work that you're doing and make sure that it is very much government respond to it, and it continues to play that role. So please, consider us to be your committee. If there is anything you think that we need to be taking up with government or pursuing, we're always pleased to hear from you, and we'll continue to support your work. So. Then Glenys, Ms Prosser, thank you very much for your evidence, for the work that you're doing. We'll bring this session to a close. Order.